Good morning. It's good to see the good number we have gathered together this morning. Those visiting with us, we appreciate your presence this morning, and we pray that all are edified as we seek to serve God. If you look in Titus chapter 2 in your Bibles, that's where I'd like to begin our study. Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2, you have Paul giving Titus these instructions as to the things that he needs to be teaching. And he says, speak things that are fitting for sound doctrine in verse 1. That sound doctrine is this idea of healthy. So the things that are needed, not talking about physical health, obviously, but spiritual health and righteousness. And so he says in verse 2, some instructions to older men, and how those older men are to be. And then he says some instruction to older women in verse 3. Now you can decide whether or not you're an older man or an older woman, and come to that conclusion, but you can see that either way, whether you're going to say you're young or old, there's some responsibilities that I've got to be working towards. Being temperate and dignified and sensible, sound in faith and love and perseverance. And older women, as they go about in their lives, and they're teaching and encouraging younger women in verse 4 to love their husbands and to love their children and to be sensible, pure workers at home. He encourages young men in verse 6 to be sensible. And in all things, show yourself being an example of good deeds with purity and doctrine, dignified. He urges bond slaves to be subject to their masters in verse 9 and the attitudes they should have. You can make application there just simply to how we should be at work in an employee-employer relationship. And you think, why all these specifics? Because there's a lot of specific things he's talking about. Well, it says in verse 11, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, instructing us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires, and to live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age. In other words, to sum it all up, if we were to take everything that he's put into place and understand what our purpose is, Titus, go teach this to people, that the grace of God offers to man salvation. And in that, there are instructions as to how we ought to live. We've been spending a few weeks in the bulletin articles covering grace and the idea of responsibilities that go along with it. And the instruction that he gives here is that you've got to live in a world that may not align to how you think as a Christian and may not align to how you live as a Christian. So you've got to deny ungodliness. You've got to deny worldly desires and instead put on sensibility, righteousness, and godliness in the present age. Now, I don't think that Paul is telling Titus that this only applies to the first century. This present age, people only needed to be sensible and righteous and godly in the first century. No, it applies throughout time. Those that would seek to come to God and those that would seek to be His and to live for Him are going to live with this in mind. I want to be righteous in how I live. I want to be sure I'm godly in the choices that I make, and I'm sensible as to how I go about engaging in my life. I had a question asked to me, and I want to seek to answer it this morning. Does it really matter what clothes I wear? Does it make a difference or not? And how you decide each day what you're going to wear. There are implications about this. It's a heavy question, I know that. I'm going to try to handle it as best I can this morning, but know this, whatever I have to say of opinion this morning, simply my opinion, look to God's Word. What does God want us to do? How does God want us to live in this? Does what I wear have an impact on you? I would say, yeah, it probably does. But let's see what the Scriptures have to say about it. What about the way you think about what I wear or what I think about you wear? Whether good or bad, whether correct or incorrect, there are implications for us and things that we need to discuss. And no matter how hard we want to argue, if you will, that our dress doesn't have an impact on the thinking of others, and we may actually want to wish that it were not so, it is absolutely true that God has made us as a physical people with certain attributes. And there are certain attributes that He has put into man and certain attributes that He's put into woman in the way that we think and the way that we view the world as He has created us. And I'll tell you at the beginning of this sermon, I don't know of a single verse that draws a line. Now, I know you may tell me on the way out, but Leviticus, the priest, and they couldn't show their thigh or what. No. You're poor reasoning at best. There's not a verse that says I've got to draw a line here, there, or somewhere on my body when it comes to things that I need to wear. But there are many principles that are laid out in the Scriptures in this topic, and examples about how the power of what we wear can be a statement. The first one I want you to notice with this is in 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Our verse is going to be verses 9 and 10. It's an interesting context. We're going to look at the whole context here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, but focus in on the beginning here in verse 9 and 10. It says, "Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim of godliness." Now, I need to know what Paul's talking about here, and you need to know what Paul's talking about here, because he has got into some specifics. And some specifics, if we don't know what he's saying, might make you worry. You may squirm in your seats here. He's talking specifically to women, I understand that. But I can just look around the room. Some of you got gold on. Some of you have got braided hair or pearls or costly garments. Am I wrong for doing so? Is that what Paul's talking about here? Well, notice in the text. Let's read the text and let's learn what he's saying here in this context. Notice he begins in verse 9 with likewise. So the things he's saying are like some other instructions that he previously discussed in the context. Back up a little bit. Let's go back up to verse 5. He says there's one God and one mediator also between God and man, the man Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for all, the testimony given at the proper time. For this, I was appointed a preacher and an apostle. I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying, as a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. So he's talking in the context about some roles. He starts here in verse 5 talking about God. And he talks about the mediator here, Jesus. And then he talks about his responsibility as a preacher and an apostle in verse 7. Then he talks about teaching the gospel to the Gentiles and how he encourages men to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Then our text in verse 9, likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim of godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Now, I know there is a lot there. We just read through it and we're just seeing what's going on. But notice here in the last half of the section, in verse 11 through 15, he starts talking about specific roles in regards to faith. So he started with, back up here, his role as an apostle and as a teacher to the Gentiles. He goes about teaching them about faith and truth. And then he talks about the man's role in leadership without wrath and dissension, is the way that he puts it there in verse 8. That is, here, men, is the attitude that you ought to have. When you are leading in worship even, you could include it in this. When you're lifting up holy hands, and for what that means, that's not today's purpose, but just in what he's talking about here in this leading. Then he says women are to continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. He is not talking to them about too little clothing. He's actually talking to them about too much. Don't throw anything at me just yet. Keep reading in the context with me. His point is not about the clothing. His point is about why. Why the braided hair? Why the gold? Why the pearls or the costly garments? That's the point in our text in verse 9 and 10. You've heard me say and talk about these not but idioms that they would use, this Hebrewism that they would use. And so you have a statement after the not, and then you have a statement after the but. And so we use it. I'll give you an example of one. I've given you several before, but here's one. It's not how a man dies, but how he lives. Now, if I say that sentence, what am I talking about? Does it not matter how he dies? Well, no, that's not the emphasis. The emphasis is on how he lives. That's the most important part of the sentence. And so we understand the focus in that sentence is on the life that the man lives. Just such a comparison here. Look at the end of verse 9. Not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. So the most importance of how the women adorn themselves here in this text is with good works, as is proper for women making a claim of godliness. He is not saying it's wrong to braid your hair. And he's not saying it's wrong to wear gold or pearls necessarily, though it may be. In the context here, it may be. He's saying the problem here is the attitude that's associated with it. The attitude that should be is the attitude of one professing godliness. Now, what does that entail? What does it entail when adorning yourself to possess godliness? Well, here he talks about things that are extravagant and extravagant in their purpose. The big hair, if you will, or the gaudy jewelry or the lavish costumes or whatever he's talking about here takes away from the attention where it should be, which is upon God and living godly. So, professing godliness is the idea here as to how one should adorn themselves. Using some examples from their time, but he's saying the point of what you do should be with an attitude of who you are as a Christian. Look in 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll look at 1 Peter 2 and 3 for a minute. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 1 through 5. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. He says, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. As they observe your chaste and respectful behavior, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart and the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands." Again, this text, I know, talking specifically to women, in this case, wives. But Peter is saying there's some specific roles that are to be played. And actually, back up to chapter 2, he begins this context talking about the attitude that one should have. These two kind of go together. If you back up to chapter 2 and in verse 11, he's talking to everyone, all these Christians. He says, "I urge you as aliens and strangers, abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent amongst the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right." He started here and he said in verse 11 and 12, you keep your behavior right even when people mistreat you. Then he says here that you need to submit yourselves to the government. What if I don't like the president? What if I don't like the governor? No, he doesn't say anything about that. He says, submit yourselves to them. In verse 11, or 13 and 14, he says, "For such," in verse 15, "is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men. Do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves of God. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king." Here's application of specifics to us to these Christians that were suffering, to us today. He talks about servants and how they were to deal with their masters. Well, what if I have a master that mistreats me? He says, be submissive to your masters. Why? This is not about me. It's about serving God. The reason I submit to the government that's been put into place, that God allows to be put in place, is because I serve God. It's not who's at the governor's mansion. It's not who's the county judge. It's about I serve God and I live my life to serve God. In verse 20, he says, for what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it patiently, endure it, that finds favor with God. And then he relates the attitude of that which Christ accomplished for us, verse 21. He says, you've been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And so, in chapter 2 here, he's making some points about how our attitudes all ought to be in our situation as to how we live. And now he gets to some specific roles. He's already mentioned servants and masters, even those that mistreat you. You may have a master treat you good. But he says, even if they mistreat you, here's your responsibility. You get to chapter 3. In our text we read already in verses 1 through 5, and he says, here's something specific about the wife. And notice again what he says in relation to this adornment in verse 3. Your adornment must not be external or merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart. Did you notice the not but idiom again? I pointed it out now. With the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Wives, your adornment is to be a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious to God. It's not to be merely external, not focused on what is worn, but putting the emphasis on the outside appearance, but on the inner heart of the wife. The focus is not to be on the outside, but what's on the inside. The focus should not be on the braiding of hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses, but serving God. Again, not saying those things are necessarily wrong. But if I'm vain to the point of that's all I'm focusing on, and I'm not focusing on taking care of my heart, making sure that I'm living for God, that's the very issue he talks about. And what's even more interesting, very important text, right before this, look in verse 1 and 2. Talking about this relationship with your husband. In the middle of verse 1, he says, even if any of them, that's your husband, are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. Wives, your influence on your husband is powerful. You're living for Christ, even if he's not. You're living for Christ has an impact on him. Even to the point of what you wear. Even to that point in what he's talking about here. That what the wife wears can have an impact on converting her husband based upon whether or not she's got this purity of heart that he's talking about here. It's not about the hair, it's about the purity of heart that he's talking about. Despite worldly trends, the beauty that we all should be concerned about, male and female, is the beauty of a pure heart towards God. A beautiful heart through the pure attire, this gentle and quiet spirit. Young men that aren't married, maybe one or two in the audience, this is the kind of woman you're looking for in a wife. One that has this gentle and quiet spirit. Not everybody's as blessed as me. Not everybody's as blessed as me to have a wife that gets more beautiful through the years. You may be burdened like she is with me. But whether or not I have the right heart, that's what it's all about. Here's the point. I'm going to have to be careful about what I wear. Both of these verses seem to make an impact on that. And so if I go to the store to buy something, it's going to be difficult for me to find modest clothes. I haven't drawn any lines this morning, but I know this fashion is constantly changing. I don't care about keeping up with the trends, but I know it's difficult to find clothes. And that may be the excuse sometimes. Say, I can't find clothes for my kids, or I can't find clothes for myself that are modest. What am I to do? Well, it's probably going to be harder. And I'm probably going to have to be more selective about what I find, what I shop for, and what I'm looking for. I don't care if I'm part of the latest trend, and we need to instill that into our own minds and instill it into our kids' minds. We're not focused on the current fashion trend. We're focusing on making our hearts for God, professing godliness in what we do, and having an inner heart, this quiet and gentle spirit that he's talking about. The question is, are you concerned about trends? Are you concerned about fashion? Or are you concerned about godliness? What makes the difference is the attitude in pursuing a life in Christ, and so that in such a way that we can present ourselves and our hearts and our adornment align with this attitude towards godliness. Notice there in verse 1, what we wear sends a message. The end of verse 1, talking about this wife that wins over her husband, and it says that they may be one without a word. So I don't have to talk to him about it. So, no, that's not the point. The point here is these impacts, like what we're talking about, have a control, if you will, on him. You know, there are certain cultural norms that we're probably all used to that we can talk about. You get a jury summons. I've never been to a jury duty before where a judge kicked someone out for not wearing appropriate clothes, but if you've read it carefully, it does tell you to wear appropriate attire for court. There may be some, I haven't had jury duty in Taylor County yet. There may be a judge around here that has a real stickler about it. But there's an expectation, isn't there? There's an expectation for what we wear when we go to a job interview, not because it is going to reflect upon my job performance, probably. But I'm going to wear a certain set of clothes to go to a job interview because I want to portray something. I want to portray a good impression on the one doing the interview. Maybe I've kept myself or something like that. We sometimes dress up for a wedding, although, I don't know, that trend kind of moves a little bit. I'm waiting on the one where nobody thinks we should wear a tie when we come to worship services, and we'll get there one day. But we have all these social norms. Why do we have them? And there, again, there's going to be opinions amongst all of us. I understand that. But if we can just agree upon this in understanding that what we wear makes an impression on others, and it makes an impression on others, right or wrong, for good or bad. Look in Genesis chapter 38. Genesis chapter 38. We're going to read starting in verse 11. Genesis 38 in verse 11. He says, Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I'm afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, and when the time of mourning ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira and the Adulamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments. This is that they had a certain attire that gave the understanding of being a widow. So she removes that in verse 14 and covered herself with a veil, wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Eliam, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up and had not been given to him as a wife. So this veil that she puts on is not what we would necessarily think about. Most commenters, whether they're right or not about this, I don't know, but we'll see a little bit more in the text to follow. They say this would be what the pagan or those that worshipped not the true God and practiced prostitution as part of their worship, those prostitutes would wear this particular veil. Whether or not that's right or not, I don't know. Text doesn't say. Here's what it says, though, in verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot. for she had covered her face. Something about this gave him an impression about who she was. It's wrong, I understand that. But you see, as you continue reading, that's exactly how he treats her. He is wrong for doing so. Don't misunderstand what I'm teaching about this right now. He's wrong for doing so, but she had a specific message that she was sending with what she was wearing as well. And her message was of her attire, the attention that would draw to it of being a prostitute. And she was treated according to the way that she was dressed. Whether right or wrong, that's what happens in the context. She makes this effort to be perceived that way in verse 14 and 15. When she covers her face in this way, it gives him that indication. She's not actually a prostitute, but she wanted to be treated like one. In this case, she dressed accordingly. He assumed that she was because of her appearance. Here's the point. Asking people to perceive us opposite of the way we present ourselves is not the way we're wired. Asking people to perceive us in a certain way based upon how we're dressed, whether knowingly or unknowingly, is going to be what happens. Regardless of what's on the inside, we get judged based upon the outward appearance. So when we get dressed every day, we need to think, am I sending the message that I'm pursuing God? Is that the message that I'm given? In 2 Samuel chapter 11, another example for us, 2 Samuel chapter 11, and don't get me wrong, again, there's blame to go all around in all these verses we're looking at, but in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 1, David has a problem. His problem is he's not doing what kings ought to be doing, number one. Number two, he's way too old for this. He is at a minimum 37, maximum 55 if you just backdate the years. So let's hit it somewhere in the middle. He's in his 40s. He's too old for this. And yet, when evening came in verse 2, David arose from his bed, walked around the roof of the king's house. From the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. He lusts after her. He acts upon that. He is absolutely in sin. I don't think that Bathsheba said, I'm going to go take a bath, and I sure hope the king sees me. I don't see anything in the text that gives that idea, but yet it had an impact on him. David should not have done what he did in this text, but he does. We've got to make a commitment. Men, we are wired different. We've got to make a commitment to ourselves. Job made the commitment to himself in Job 31:1. He said, I made a covenant with my eyes. How could I gauge upon a virgin? He said, I'm not going to do that. I understand how we are wired. I understand what God has put into us, this urge that he's put into us that should be to our wife. We've got to determine that that's not how we're going to live when we deal with others. In 1 John chapter 2, to finish making this particular point, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, it says this, do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. All that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, from the world. This world is passing away, also its lust, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. Yes, a woman's dress can impact you. Do you just watch the Cowboys to see the cheerleaders? You're not watching them to play good football. So you tell me. What's our purpose? Where are we looking? What are we spending our time with? And I know many preachers might not say it maybe as eloquently or bluntly as I had this morning, may argue about it and say it's purely the man's fault that he lusts. And I understand we've got our own part in this game. But somebody help us. It's all around us. The fulfillment of the lust, but the point seeing that what you wear can impact others, whether we intend to or don't intend to. Innocently tempting others or simply harming their own reputation by appearance. I may have no intention of causing someone else to sin. But I got to be careful. Take a good look in the mirror. What am I showing with what I am wearing? I'm not saying it's right. A woman can be perfectly dressed modestly and some creepo still has the wrong thoughts. I get that. I understand it. But people can't see your heart. We can't see that. We've got to know you for that, so don't let them make assumptions about you based upon your appearance. Don't let that happen. Men, you're not excluded from this. I need to add this in. I don't know who started designing men's shorts. I don't. I've got a lot of thoughts on this, but this is not Corey's ranting hour. But you know, you used to think, well, it's probably not that big of a deal with guys. You need to stop and think about what you do. I'm just saying, sometimes shorts on men are a lot shorter than I want to see. Whether or not you're going to take off your shirt while you're working so that everybody can see. We can wear things that are too tight, too scarce, too flashy, all those sort of things. We've got to keep our hearts right in the same sense. We need to remind ourselves of what's correct to live godly. I need to have the right idea about myself and how I look at women. And I need to have the right idea about what I believe is beautiful in a woman. Because God's vision is of a gentle, and quiet spirit, one that can win over someone disobedient to the word by their behavior. That should make the point in our mind about what true beauty really is. This can be a stumbling block, for men especially. I know it can be a stumbling block for all, but we're visually oriented. I understand that. Men, are we going to trip over the block or not? There's disagreements about this. I know. You've got thoughts, and you're free to tell me on the way out. I appreciate the good feedback that I get from you. So there may be disagreements about this, and there certainly are disagreements about at the exact point which the line is crossed from acceptable to too tight or acceptable to too short or all that sort of stuff. So I tried to come up with just some things that would be useful for all of us to consider. Maybe just if these are good in your process, then the lesson's been useful. When you're getting dressed, ask yourself, why am I wearing this? If our motive is something contrary to biblical principles that we've talked about this morning, you need to change clothes. End of story. Ask yourself, what will be the likely impression that others will have when they see me wearing this? And when you answer these questions, if you say, I foresee in the future someone's going to have the wrong impression about it, and it's not going to be that I have professed godliness or I have professed the right attitude towards humility or a quiet and gentle spirit. It's not about avoiding criticism from others. That's not it. But from the depths of my heart, is what I'm wearing glorifying God? Ask yourself whether or not you're dressing to please God, and whether or not you're dressing to please God is projected onto others that see you. Cultivate your inner beauty and respect yourself with your outward appearance. And don't be shocked if somebody treats you how you're dressed, whether right or wrong. Psalm 149 verse 4 says, the Lord takes pleasure in his people. He will beautify the afflicted ones with salvation. What's the most beautiful thing we can have? But serving living God. Let's not see how close to the line we can get. Let's focus on having the right attitude. Let's close our lesson this morning and read in the book of Ruth, please. Ruth chapter 3. Ruth chapter 3, right past Judges. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 3. It says, wash yourself therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you shall do. She said to her, all that you say I'll do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward. And behold, a woman laying at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. And he said, May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether rich or poor. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Boy, we could all have that reputation. That to come and to be Boaz's wife, he says, no, I'm the one that's blessed in this. For you are a woman of excellence. How can I best dress so as to be recognized as a servant of the Most High God? Maybe something we consider. Thank you for your good attention this morning. I pray this lesson is something that we go home and we study more and we seek to have a better understanding so that we're pleasing to God in the choices that we make in the life that we live. Ryan's going to lead us in a song at this time. We'll use it as a song of encouragement at this time in our service that we can offer unto you this opportunity if we can help you as you seek to serve God. If you need to come to Christ, you need to put on Christ in baptism, this is the time we can help you with that. We can help you at any time with that, but if you're thinking of that right now, we'd love that opportunity to help you with it. Or if you need the prayers of the congregation, let us know how we can be of assistance in a public manner as we stand together and as we sing.